Escrow scenario number 4, the unprepared buyer. This is the case of a buyer who is super excited at the beginning of the purchase agreement, sends the earnest money, genuinely plans on purchasing the property, but maybe they were planning to raise the rest of the needed money from friends or family or from some bank, i.e. a financier or a mortgage lender. But instead of making sure they have all of the financing locked in before the inspection period ends, which is the recommended practice, they took a risk and shopped around for different mortgage lenders and were hoping to get one to come through, but nobody assessed the buyer to be creditworthy enough to be given the remaining amount of money. In which case, because the seller upheld their end of the bargain, but the buyer did not, the earnest money, unfortunately for the buyer, will go to the seller. So let's quickly show this scenario. This is the case of the unprepared buyer. So let's create an escrow agreement by entering the app, coming over to the contracts library, clicking on the contract we want to use, customizing it to our needs, clicking create contract, providing a digital signature. And after the request is mined, we now have a contract we can use to execute a real estate transaction. So let's take care of all of the Algorand protocol prerequisites. Let's send the deposit. That allows us to use this smart contract. Requiring a deposit is an incentive in the Algorand protocol that prevents people from using the blockchain for pointless reasons. We are now opting in the smart contract to be able to hold USDCA. That's part of the protocol. You can't just send tokens or ERC20 tokens to any address. Each address has to explicitly opt in to allowing other addresses to send that particular token to it. So we are now sending the first escrow payment. This is the case of the unprepared buyer. So we're in the inspection period. The buyer is super excited, doing everything in their power to purchase this house, but they're going to take the risk and let this date elapse and hope that the financing comes through before the closing date. This does happen. It's not recommended. It's very risky, but it does happen, right? So now the seller is waiting for the money. The buyer is shopping around to different mortgage lending companies, talking to family and friends, trying to get that other $100,000. But unfortunately for the buyer, nobody assesses the buyer to be creditworthy enough. So what's going to happen is the closing date is going to elapse without the buyer sending the remaining funds. And the way this typically goes is because the seller upheld their side of the bargain, but the buyer did not, the earnest money, unfortunately for the buyer, is going to go to the seller. So the seller can leave notes all along the way to cover their tracks in case the buyer wants to be crazy and actually try to go to court. The buyer can request a contract revision to give themselves more time to raise the necessary funds. Maybe the seller will agree, maybe not. Because the funds weren't raised in time, the seller will be able to withdraw the first escrow payment. This is how this typically goes. If you're dealing with an unprepared buyer, this incentivizes the buyer to be prepared, not to be joking around or messing with the seller's time. The seller is trying to sell the house as fast as possible. So anyways, that is the case of the unprepared buyer.